Today I'm joined by J.R. Covey, the founder of Fear Proof, a cognitive behavioral group curriculum that explores our fears and the impact that they are having on us. So, J.R., thanks so much for being here.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. This is such a pleasure, such a joy, because it really is the opportunity for me to do the thing that I am most afraid of, which is to be on camera. And embracing that is part of finding victory in this area. I wrote a cognitive behavioral group therapy curriculum. It's a 6-week journey where we teach people to identify, isolate, and overcome fear through faith, wisdom, and work. And the process of recognizing the stories we tell ourselves about life's experiences are actually more tied to the results than the experiences themselves. And so we help people write the story that's actually going to benefit them the most.
And I have actually been through your course. And we'll get to that in a bit. But first, could you start with what motivated you to put all of this work in?
That's a great question, because I was definitely not putting this together thinking, here's what I'm going to do, create this life plan for people to overcome fear and be their best and face the things that are holding them back. I literally did a deep dive into what does the Bible say about fear. And in the process of taking a look at what does Scripture say about fear, I found that there was common themes and narratives, and it came in really handy in my life and my wife, who's also a believer. And after teaching it for a couple of years, I really had an internal drive that I needed to go and face my own core fear, which at the time was, and honestly still is, inadequacy. And the idea of giving somebody else the opportunity to judge me based on my scholastic merit was terrifying. You could give me snakes and spiders and guns. Not afraid of that stuff. Somebody judging me and telling me I'm not smart enough was terrifying.
Yeah, and give a little more background, if you would, if you're comfortable, on you.
Sure.
Because I know some of your story.
Absolutely.
And so to understand where you've come from and all of the things that you've accomplished, and then to hear you say, my number one fear is inadequacy.
Yeah. And it's funny for people who meet me in real life. I'm 6'6" and 300 pounds, so I don't walk in like somebody who's probably dealing with an inadequacy issue.
No, you don't.
Totally is. But I grew up in a family where one of my older siblings was everybody's favorite guy. He was perfect. And I grew up in a shadow thinking I could never be what my older brother is. He was brilliant. He was good looking. He was graduated through his doctorate with 1 A-, I think. He was invited into Mensa at 19 years old. He's just brilliant guy. And I remember thinking, I could never be that. Like, I can't do all the things he can do. I can't be all the things he can be. And so I lived from a place of just expecting myself to not be good enough. And then I got married. And funny thing is, when you get married, all of that stuff comes to the surface as soon as you have a spouse. There's no hiding it anymore. And getting married to my wife, I discovered that she was raised in Ukraine, and they have horribly oppressive cultural fears on people when it comes to appearance and the way you look. Like, she was taught from a very young age, it didn't matter if you were okay on the inside. All that mattered is if you looked okay. And so that was what, between my wife and I was like, there's stuff that's going on that's not clicking. And it was literally a drive to try and help her overcome her fear and anxiety. And then going back and getting my degree in counseling psychology, I discovered that everything science had to say was the exact same thing I was teaching out of this little Bible small group. They just use different terminology. Right? There's a scripture verse that says, as a believer, I'm to take every thought captive and make it subject to the mind of Christ. Science calls it metacognition, which is just thinking about your thinking. I know that's life-changing for people going through our groups when they realize that just because they have a thought doesn't mean they have to immediately emotionally enmesh with it and accept it as concrete reality and own it.
Yeah.
They can actually disagree with themselves.
Yeah. And so the goal of the work that you do now, because you've been facilitating these groups, I've been through one of the groups, I cried. I'm going to put it out there for everybody.
I cried.
So the goal of the work that you're doing now with the groups, apply that to business. How would business leaders?
Yeah, so it was fascinating. We were teaching these groups and we came across business leaders that over and over again would say, you know, I really feel like what you're teaching is something that would be really applicable in the business space. And I realized that the methods and the tools that we use and how we teach people to overcome is really very universal, because we don't teach anybody, here's how to overcome your fear. I don't know how to overcome anybody's fear. What we've developed is a set of tools that helps people recognize through trial and error, where are my beliefs coming from? Why do I believe that? Do I want to believe that? And if not, what can I believe instead? Yeah. And so in the business sphere, we've seen it with all kinds of teamwork dynamics like groupthink. People are afraid to speak up because they don't want to be the dissenting voice. Or goal setting, motivation theory, like every aspect of life is impacted when you go in expecting a negative outcome. And that really is the definition I've given to fear, is the expectation of a negative outcome. When you have that in any arena, whether it's family or work or out in society, it changes how you show up. And so helping people in the business world recognize this belief that I have about the outcome coming from this sequence of events is either going to help me or hinder me. And so specifically with mergers and acquisitions and the sale of a company, and I did a real deep dive for several weeks looking into what are those core beliefs that people have that literally reduces the value of their company when they try and sell it. And we found it was fascinating.
Yeah, I think that part of the reason that is so impactful is because on some level you're always dealing with people.
Right.
We can automate so much. We can use AI, which is the buzzword right now. But on some level you're always doing business with a person, and Absolutely. It comes down to the relational interaction. So can you describe more of the process and how it would apply with clients?
Certainly, yeah. So there's 5 steps to writing a story. And it's handy because it actually creates the acronym STEPS, STEPS. And so the first thing is S, the situation. When you're trying to figure out what's going on, first just defining the situation in the simplest terms possible. No emotion, no opinion, no narrative, just here is the situation that we're in. When you take a look at that situation, then you ask yourself the letter T, the tale that you're telling yourself about that. When I look at this, how am I feeling about what's going on? If my feelings could talk, if my fear could talk, what would it say? What's that expectation, the letter E? What expectations do I have based on this story that's being written? What are the outcomes that I'm looking for? What am I thinking is going to happen? And then from those expectations, you can draw out and start to recognize, it becomes much clearer what the problems are. You know, if I expect that, that's probably not helping me. And when you can identify the problems with it, then you can create a solution, which is, what can I believe instead? What can I expect as an alternative to the tale I've been telling myself? And from that place, you craft the story, you craft the expectation, you craft the tale that you want to tell. And honestly, this situation that we're in right now, last night, I mean, for years, I was probably telling about being on camera when we were teaching your group. For years, I've talked about being on camera is absolutely mortifying for me. And the funny
you'll
thing
go
is,
on stage in front of people.
Totally, yeah. You can give me 1,000 people in a microphone and I'm fine because I feel like I have the people. But being in front of a camera, I was always awkward. It was really uncomfortable. And the funny thing is, it started sending me into some research because I'm always looking for what does science have to say about expectations and narrative and fear, and that's my world. And I came across some research that just sent me down this rabbit hole, recognizing how close anxiety and excitement or anticipation are, both physiologically, neurologically. It's a really similar experience. The only difference is that thing that I don't yet see, it's either a positive thing or a negative thing. Because we've all been kids, and the day before you're going on vacation or camp or Christmas or whatever's happening, you've got the same nerves, they're rushing, but you have a positive expectation. The difference between that and sitting outside the principal's office is such a tiny, minute distinction that you can actually hack your brain if you just keep convincing yourself this, what I'm feeling right now, this animated level is actually anticipation, it's excitement. So I spent an hour last night laying in bed looking at the ceiling going, I'm excited about tomorrow. I'm excited about this. This is what I'm feeling. I'm excited. Because it really is an awesome opportunity for me to face the thing that I've dreaded doing, honestly, for years now.
Well, I'm glad you're here, and you're doing great. So, all right, going back to my notes. What is one narrative that most hinders a leader trying to transition out of a business? You mentioned M&A earlier.
Yeah. That's a great question. And one of my business mentors and one of the board members actually was, which I didn't even know at the time, a part of 150 acquisitions and had himself written a book and been a part of evaluating over 1,000 different companies for M&A. And he's in his 80s now, but decades ago, that was his world. And so in the process of talking about what we were doing, he was like, hey, I can chime in on that. And I was like, wow, that would be great. You have decades of experience in this. And so I leaned on him and read a bunch of articles. But I found one of the things that came up super frequently is a leader trying to transition and holding on to everything, trying to micromanage, trying to keep their hands in all of the jars. And it directly tied to a lower valuation, because it scares away investors. They don't want to buy a ship that's going to sink the minute the captain gets off.
Right. In your research, what did you find was the cause or the root of that fear? I mean, we've seen it. Some leaders are better at letting go than others.
For sure.
But what did you find was the cause of the fear of letting go?
Yeah, so there was a real common thread that sounded something like, I'm the only one who can do this, or I know this business better than anybody. This has been my world. I need to make sure. Or if I don't do it, then something's going to fall through the cracks. It won't get done the best it could be if it's not me doing it. And the problem with that is your people are not equipped to take over if you haven't equipped them to take over. If they don't think they can do it without you, they won't be able to. And you're not doing them any favors by over controlling and manipulating and keeping your hands in everything. One of the best pieces of advice I got was to tell business leaders to take a vacation test. Go do 2 or 3 weeks away. Don't answer emails. Don't solve problems. Don't give solutions. Don't give input on anything. Just walk away. Because that's going to be very telling in where are there some cracks? Where does there need to be better procedures and processes and protocols written and communicated and created so that people not only have the ability to do it, but feel empowered to do it. They know that they can do it.
One of the things that I hear internally from our operators that are working in businesses, getting them ready to sell, is they'll ask the owner the question of, can you take a month off? Usually the answer is no, right? And so then the follow-up question is, what are the tasks that prevent you from taking a month off?
That's a great
And then we
question.
make a list of those and we start figuring out who else could do these tasks, right? So reduction of owner dependency. I'm not giving away any trade secrets here based on what we do. Owner dependency is highly devaluing for a business for the same exact reason you just said. Nobody wants to buy a ship that they don't know if it'll run without the captain,
For sure.
right? So coming back to my notes, would you already walked through steps, but can you give an example other than last night? Give an example where maybe you've given that to someone, they've taken it and applied it to a situation, and then how did the outcome change, or how did the situation change based on applying the steps?
So specifically, literally dealing with what we're talking about, if you are in a mindset that you're convinced this can't be done right or perfectly or even well without me, that's a narrative that has to change. It has to be challenged because the owner has to realize I'm doing my people and my company and the brand and the future owners all a disservice by not getting out of the way. So when you recognize, okay, the situation is I have a company to sell, I want to get the most value out of it. Very simple, not a lot of narrative, not a lot of opinion. That is the situation. And then you start to dig into, okay, well, what am I telling myself about this situation? And the question that I said, I'll repeat it again, I love is, if your feelings could talk, if your fears could talk, what would they say about that? Because it's really revealing. A lot of people don't think about what they're thinking about until you ask them to, until you challenge them and you put a magnifying glass on it. Like, what's really behind your feeling like you have to over manage and micromanage and control and be involved in everything? And so when you recognize the situation is, I'm trying to sell the company, the tale I'm telling myself is I have to do it or it won't be done right, The expectation is something's going to happen. Bad things come from me not being involved. And the problem with that is it's the opposite. Bad things come from you being overly involved.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not letting go is the problem. And so you have to write a story where your goal is not to make the company as valuable as you can make it by your own strength. Your goal is to make the company as valuable as you can without you.
Yeah. Agreed. Now, we're going to go improv because I'm done with my notes.
For sure.
How would you apply this across different levels of a business? So we've talked a lot about leadership. We've talked about ownership. How does it apply for middle managers or even folks? And I mean, we've all had to work our way up
For sure.
in business, right? How does it apply to that person that's kind of down there at the bottom and they're still figuring out what they want to do and maybe they feel like their job is not the greatest?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. In fact, I'm in the process of crafting a very specific curriculum for a major nationwide mortgage company who our goal is to take sales reps who are just not quite clicking. They've got potential, they're smart enough, they're capable, but there's something getting in the way. And this is crucial for people being able to stay in the seat and reduce churn, is to recognize what story am I telling myself about dialing the next phone number?
Yeah.
What story am I telling myself about asking for the close? And I come from a sales realm, so the idea of talking about sales is very easy for me. I spent over a decade selling things. And so there's a lot of stories that people say, like, I don't want to be rejected again. Like, I hate feeling like I'm being told no over and over again. And as long as you have that fear of being told no, it's going to impact the ability. I mean, it's just the phone, it's going to be harder. It's going to be heavier. It's going to be harder to push the buttons to dial that next number, to have that next face-to-face contact, because you're trying to dread the thing that you're afraid of. And it's an effort that you're putting in. Most people don't realize it. It's just as easy to believe for the best as it is to believe for the worst. There's nothing more complicated. It's just believing the best, having a positive expectation is unfamiliar. It's different. It's not what you were probably taught.
Yeah. I had recently, I recorded with Dr. Kirk Adams, from former CEO of Lighthouse for the Blind and American Foundation for the Blind. And we talked about an interesting concept, internal locus of control.
Great. That's, yeah, absolutely.
So I want to go there for a second because
sure.
when you're talking about steps, it seems like there's kind of two types of people in the world. Those who have an internal locus of control, those who develop an internal locus of control, those who develop an external locus of control. So how does that show up in business, and how can your program help those who maybe have that external locus of control? Totally.
So that's a great question. It's in one of the slides in the Fear-Proof curriculum. I don't know if you remember, but yeah, an internal locus of control is a belief that I have the ability to impact change. I can affect something happening. An external locus of control is the French c'est la vie, c'est la vie. Whatever will be. Que sera, sera. Like, it is what it is. It's going to be what it's going to be. I don't have anything to do with it. When you teach people that they do not have agency, they will not affect change.
Yeah.
They won't, because they don't even think it's worth trying. And I mean, I lived there. The expectation of mediocrity might as well have been tattooed across my forehead. I didn't think what I was going to do was going to be good enough, so there's really not that much of a point in putting in an effort.
Right.
Because why would you strive for something that you didn't expect to work out?
Isn't it interesting, though, also, just realizing this, you really woke up and changed that when you were trying to help somebody else.
Oh, 100%.
So you didn't go about changing your locus of control because you wanted a different life.
Right.
You were trying to positively impact someone else.
Totally.
Which goes to this point that I've actually commented on LinkedIn before, that you need people who need you. We all need each other, right? There's this community aspect. And in business, I feel oftentimes in bad cultures, that community aspect has been lost. And then you have these extremes where you have an owner who thinks they're the only one. They have maybe too much of an internal locus of control. And then you have workers who haven't been given enough maybe guidance, direction, encouragement, and they have these external locuses, loci? How do you say that? They have an external locus of control. And they feel like nothing they do matters, so they don't really give a lot of effort. So, that being said, it's a long setup. How do you go about changing cultures through the Fear Proof program?
That's a great question. And it always has to start with the top.
Okay.
You can't change culture bottom up because anybody who's not willing to change won't change. And I've had a lot of people over the years that were like, oh, you should talk to my friend, my brother-in-law, my mom, so and so, they need this curriculum, you got to do it. And I tell everybody the same thing. Until somebody's ready to change, there's no amount of advice that I'm going to give anybody that's going to be any good. Because you can invite people into change, but you can't make them change. And especially when there's a power dynamic, a differential based on somebody having seniority, superiority, authority over other people.
Yeah.
Unless they're willing to change, you're fighting a losing battle.
Yeah. So somebody who heard your answer just now might think, well, what about managing up the chain of command, right? So you can affect some level of change, you
Sure.
know, through your own responsibility and your own actions. But if you're middle management or below, what would you say to that person who's like, well, I'm gonna affect change from where I'm at?
So I invite everybody into that, and you should teach people how to treat you. They will treat you the way they think they can and should treat you based on how you allow them to treat you. And so if you have managers who are above you, who are difficult and demanding, own your space. Like, this is the space I'm in. I have this authority and this responsibility, and I'm going to own this. And I can't make somebody change, but I can make sure you don't treat me in a way that I'm not willing to be treated. And you can, in a way, change that dynamic, but you can't change the way somebody treats other people if you don't have the authority or seniority. When you're at the top, you have the ability to make downline change. You can say, here's how we're going to do things. This is the direction the ship's going. You can be on the ship or not on the ship. But the guy at the bottom who's just trying to own his spot, he can really only control as much as he can control.
Right.
And so if you want to make a dynamic shift in the direction the boat's going, it's going to be the rudder that's going to do it. You can have everybody lean to one side of the ship if you want to. And sure, you might start to move in a direction.
You might achieve a little drift.
Exactly. But if you want to affect lasting change, significant change, course change, it has to come from somebody at the top saying, here's how things are going to be. And it comes from humility and a recognition that maybe the way I've done it isn't the way it has to be done or should be done. Maybe that's not the best way to do it. Maybe that's the way it has worked, but it doesn't have to always be that way. And so I would invite people into a sense of humility. I've been teaching this for years. This really is my world. This is my life message. And I tell people all the time, I don't come from this as a perspective of the expert that knows everything about this. I come from this as the expert of the guy who is stumbling down this path one step at a time and just inviting people along the way. Like, hey, I know, like literally, I just told you last night I was in bed staring at the ceiling, telling myself how excited I am.
Yeah.
This isn't a thing that, okay, I've got this figured out and now everything's easy from now on. It's just, it's a set of tools that helps people recognize, like, hey, am the thoughts I'm thinking helping me or hurting me?
Yeah.
I mean, how's that working out for you? It's a great question. Like, well, this is the way we've always done it. Okay, well,
Yeah.
how's that working out for you?
Yeah. So I want to maybe back up. We probably should have talked about this earlier, but just talking about the concept of fear. And before we started the cameras, we ran through some of the most common fears that people have. So would you touch on, okay, A, what the heck is fear?
Yeah.
Right? And B, what are the most common fears that people struggle with?
Sure. No, it's a great question. So the research is kind of mixed. It's somewhere between 1 and 7, depending on the article and the study that you're talking about. I tend to believe it's probably 4 or 5 core fears, depending on how you parse out rejection and judgment. But the most common ones are, in my case, inadequacy. And in the science and a lot of the articles, they refer to it as a fear of negative evaluation,
Okay.
FNE. There's another common one is injury and illness sensitivity, a fear of death, a fear of pain, a fear of discomfort, a fear of not being okay and things hurting, fear of rejection, which is isolation. And that causes that my wife, who is a recovered people pleaser, had spent years, and she would absolutely destroy herself, wear herself out, just trying to make sure everybody else was okay. And everybody else thought she was the sweetest person on earth, and she is. I mean, I adore my wife. She's amazing. But I was the one at the end of the day that she would come home and just be like, oh, I'm exhausted. And I'm like, yeah, because you were trying to carry not only your burdens, but everybody else's burdens too.
Yeah.
And that's exhausting. And so the idea that I have to make sure somebody else is okay in order for me to be okay is an absolute trap. We all have to be okay, regardless of whether anybody else wants us to be okay, likes that we're okay, is okay with us or themselves, because I can't change that. You can't change that. Only they can change that. So some of the most common ones are rejection and inadequacy in a lot of the work that we've done. People feeling like, if I do this, if I fail, if I do it wrong, I'm going to be judged. I'm going to have people walk away. I'm going to be isolated. I'm not going to have people or community or acceptance or however that looks. Yeah. And it's crazy because there's innumerable number of ways that fear gets packaged, but it really does boil down to some concepts that at the end of the day, we were created to be social beings in community, in connection with others. That's just in our DNA. That's part of how we were crafted. And so things that go against our core nature, our self-capacity to regulate and manage the world around us, those are things that will, when you start to boil down, that's really what's behind the fears.
Yeah. So how can leaders in business, and I guess you could even apply this to life and your family, how can leaders create an environment where others can feel safe and alleviate some of those fears? And how does that correlate to an increase in performance and productivity?
For sure. I think honestly, one of the greatest things that I've done in the groups is transparency of myself. I will own all of my fears and inadequacies to everybody. I mean, I don't think that there's a thing people could go through that I haven't been through, and I can connect and relate because I've been there. I've been afraid of that. I've worried about that. I've carried that burden. I feel like I'm equipped and enabled because I've faltered in all of those ways.
I remember you made a comment when we were in the group. You said, if I ever run for president, nobody can use anything against me because I already wrote it in my book.
Exactly. I would be the first politician to have no skeletons in the closet because I've outed myself in all of these ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, that's a fear, though, for leaders.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, and how do you get around that? How do you show, again, going back to the increase in performance and productivity? So sometimes with business leaders, you got to bring it to the bottom line, right?
Yeah.
And if they have a fear of showing their own fears and inadequacies, how do you show them with science, with data,
totally,
that doing this will create an increase in performance and productivity and teamwork among your staff?
So I would challenge anyone to find any research anywhere that would indicate that inauthentic living, inauthentic relationship benefits anyone on any long-term metric ever. If you're carrying a mask, if you're being inauthentic, if you're trying to put on a face, if you're trying to pretend that you're something, it's like trying to uphold lies. Like the more lies you tell, the more details you've got to try and weave into the story to cover your bases, and it becomes exhausting and it falls apart, and people see the cracks. For those leaders who think that they've put on this perfect face and that all of the people see them the way they want to be seen, it would be real eye-opening if they really knew the truth. There's that show, The Boss, Undercover Boss, where they send owners and high-level executives into companies and they see what is it really like on the ground floor. Everybody would be surprised if they knew how the rest of the world perceived them. Because I guarantee it's never the person you think they see when you're trying to put on a mask.
Yeah.
People see through it. People recognize something's off. People know you're not being authentic.
Now, there's also a level of discernment that comes.
For sure.
You can't just share everything all at once.
For sure.
How do you coach leaders around, I guess, disclosure, right?
For sure.
You don't want to just dump all your fears and inadequacies out for everybody.
Yeah, you're not trying to get everybody below you to carry your mess or your junk.
Right.
But what you need to do is hold it with an open hand. I have all of the failures, all of the shortcomings, all of the lessons in my life in an open hand. And if there's a situation or there's a dynamic where, hey, you know, this thing is going to make you and I bond because we have this shared experience, then I'll bring it out. I don't share everything all the time with everyone because it's not actually going to aid in intimacy and connectedness and relationship.
Right.
It's just the willingness to share any of it.
So that brings me to another question then. Do you think that individuals' fears that we carry around impact where we end up professionally, what roles we take on?
100%.
So I'm director of business development, right? When you said the heaviness of dialing that phone, man, I've worked in cold calling environments where everyone was stressed out.
Yeah.
I don't think there was a single person on the team that didn't have an ulcer.
Right.
And I had 2 coworkers die. That's a true story, by the way. I'm not sure that it was exactly stress related, but when you were talking about that, I'm like, man, I feel that. And that fear of rejection. I've dialed those numbers, I've picked up that phone, and I've hoped that somebody didn't answer on the other end. So
absolutely.
How do you, have you noticed that it breaks down into categories of people who tend to have this type of fear tend to gravitate toward that type of job?
So I think it's really interesting that it's more about what we take positive from a situation than the negative, unless we're talking about a deep-seated, like almost phobia level fear where like, I can't do that thing. Like I would have 6 months ago said, I can't do this, what we're doing right now, sitting on a camera on a stage and in front of a set. I would have said, I can't do this. But obviously I'm here and I'm doing it, and so far I've survived. So most of the time, I think it's the things that just make us feel comfortable. And sometimes that's discomfort reduction, and sometimes that's pleasure increase. We find the thing that we tend to not hate and get through and is the least painful, but it's oftentimes not directly related to our fear. And that really has more to do with the fact that there's so many infinite numbers of ways we can interpret life experiences. It's so bespoke, it's so custom to every person's life experience that it would be really hard until you start to drill down. And oftentimes people don't know what those fears are on an individual level until you start to peel back the layers. Right. Like I've had this discussion more times than I can count. People say all the time that, oh, my greatest fear is public speaking. And I tell them it's not. Your greatest fear is the implications of public speaking. It's not the public speaking itself. And you can prove that by crafting a situation where public speaking becomes completely comfortable. Yeah. Okay, I want you to go in front of a group of 5-year-old kids, and I want you to count to 10 in your native language, and then you're done. There's really no power dynamic, so you're not afraid of 5-year-old kids judging you. There's really no fear of not being able to successfully speak your native tongue. You're counting, that's not a difficult thing. And the reason is, when you start to peel back the layers, and the challenge we teach people is called the so what challenge. They say, oh, my greatest fear is public speaking. Okay, well, so what? What's the worst thing that could happen if you go up there and you just bomb? You get up there and it's awful. Well, yeah, but I'm going to get up there and I'm going to look like a total idiot. Okay. So what? What's the worst thing that happens? Comedians go and make total fools of themselves and turn it into a career. So getting on stage and making a fool of yourself is not fatal.
Right.
It's not life-defining unless you make it so.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that, honestly, in our culture and in the generations, we've taught people that failing is like this hell-worthy trespass. Like it's the worst thing that could ever happen. You go and you make a fool of yourself or you fail and it's life-defining because you went and failed. Like that's awful. And I tell people to embrace it. No, go out there and faceplant. I was literally telling myself that driving here, like, okay, I go and I'm horrible and none of the stories I share connect and none of the information I have is valuable. I'm still going to go home. My wife's still going to love me. My kids are going to jump in my lap. Like my life is going to be okay.
Yeah.
I know where my next meal's coming from. I'm not really in a place that I can give that much power and authority to an outcome like a video shoot.
Yeah. So why would somebody be afraid to read your book, engage with your program, or reach out to you?
Honestly, it's people don't want to see what's inside. And I spent my my late teens and into my 20s completely self-medicating with everything I could get my hands on because I was not comfortable alone in my own brain.
Despite all your success, because you had a tremendous amount of success.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I mean, financially I was doing fine. I got to take vacations and parties and toys and was involved in a .com that did really well when I was young. But on the inside, I could not be quiet in my own head because I would start to hear the judgments, stories, expectations of other people, things going on. That broken record that was going on in the back of my head was absolutely just mortifying. I couldn't put up with it. So I used alcohol and drugs and gambling and anything else I could get my hands on to just numb and distract.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I was willing to face that thing that's on the inside that I could start to dismantle all of those things. And honestly, I can say now that I never had an alcohol problem, a drug problem, a gambling problem, a nicotine problem. Those weren't the problems. Those were all symptoms of a greater problem. I had an identity problem. I couldn't be me. And so I can absolutely empathize with somebody who's like, yeah, that's great for somebody else. No, it's great for all of us.
Yeah.
It's great for me as the author and the creator of this curriculum. It's great for everybody. There's nobody in life who doesn't face fear or experience fear, unless, to be honest, you are way down the path of sociopath. Like, your brain is not functioning correctly. And then you've got other problems. Those are bigger problems. Everybody has fears. Everybody has negative expectations because our brain was designed with self-preservation in mind.
Yeah.
Your brain's goal is to take care of yourself. And so those things that hurt, those things that wound, those things that even make you uncomfortable, they teach you to avoid, push away, keep back, don't.
Yeah. So if somebody wanted to face their fear, they want to reach out and they either want to jump into a group or maybe they want to bring you into their business, where do they find you? How do they connect with you?
For sure.
How do they get started?
That's my favorite question. Fearproof.me. That's my website. And I love that domain because everybody who comes in has to type Fearproof me. When you come to the site, it'll give you opportunities. There's one-on-one coaching, there's group classes that are available. And it's really for people who are in that place of developmental readiness that they say, okay, I'm willing to figure out what's not working.
Right.
And it's not for people, limited to people who have these very deep-seated clinical levels of phobia. Because oftentimes those are much easier to address. If you are super afraid of dogs and it's always about dogs and the dogs are things you're afraid of, that's actually really easy. We know how to go from a distant experience to a closer experience, and eventually you're petting dogs. Like, we know how to retrain the amygdala so that it no longer assumes dogs are dangerous. That's my favorite example because it's so common. People are afraid of dogs a lot of the time. My wife is one of them. Unfortunately, she still gets kind of skittish around dogs. I mean, I literally almost lost my eye to a dog. I have a very little scar under the orbital bone because I had a dog hit me in the face. I could have lost my vision. I could have created a fear towards dogs after that experience. Thankfully, I'd already been teaching the curriculum for so many years. When that happened as an adult, I was like, okay, I know exactly how I'm going to encode short-term memory into long-term memory in a way that I'm going to not adapt to this negative expectation. And so somebody who has one experience with a dog and it's getting bitten, then 100% of your dog experiences are getting bitten.
Yeah.
You get 99 more experiences starting from a distance, okay, watching videos about dogs, reading stories about dogs, hearing people talk about dogs, and slowly getting closer. You eventually give the limbic system enough new information that it decides, you know, that should be considered an outlier and not an expectation that dogs are dangerous.
Right. Well, JR, we could keep going for another hour, probably 2, 3, 4, because to your point, there's so many fears that we can talk about. But thanks for coming in today, giving us a taste of what it is that you do. Hope to have you back. Would love to hear more stories. Hopefully you'll have some additional engagement with business owners. I would hope as a result from this that folks would reach out to you and bring you into their teams and help overcome some of those fears and increase productivity. So
That would be
appreciate you
great.
being here.
And I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to look into a camera, because this is the thing that I was most afraid of and have been talking about for years.